Alright guys, welcome back to the start of a new project. So in this one we're going to be building a full bedroom set. So this is going to include a wide dresser, a tall dresser, 2 nightstands, and then a wall hanging mirror. So this project is going to be getting run a little bit differently than I've done in the past. When I've done these kind of series videos, what I've done is I've kind of tried to put out a video every week of just kind of the progress that I'm doing. For this one, I'm going to record the whole series, put everything together, and then kind of release it all pretty quickly after that. And so the reason I really want to do this is because I want to try and make a more cohesive, more instructional series. And then also with kind of the final compilation videos, I want to make sure that they make a little bit more sense. But anyway, in this first video, what we're going to do is we're going to start by going over the plans. I'm just going to talk you guys through some of the stuff, some of the designs that I went through with these pieces. Then we're going to move on to kind of laying out our lumber in that. And so I've already gone out and picked up all my materials. I've got a ton of drawer slides stashed away in a cupboard behind me. I've got all my lumber stashed in the garage here. It's been acclimating for about a week now, so it should be mostly good to go. And yeah, I'm really just ready and excited to get working on this project because it's a pretty big one. And so these are the plans that I'm gonna be working from. So you can see here the 4 different pieces. There's gonna be 2 of these nightstands, so 5 different pieces that I'm gonna be creating here. And so for the mirror, that's going to be the last thing we end up doing because it's kind of its own standalone thing. It's got all of its own dimensions and that. It's just a nice, easy piece to do by itself. For the rest of these pieces, there's enough consistent pieces and sizes between them that I wanted to make sure I do them all at the same time. And so when I went through and designed these pieces, I made sure that all 3 side widths on these pieces were the exact same. So all of our side panel pieces, except for the vertical parts, are all the exact same dimensions. So the best part about having an actual set of plans like this, even for someone like me who I know the design, I built it myself in SketchUp, having the digital plans here, having all my dimensions easily visible, makes it a lot easier because when I need quick reference, I know that I can just pop over here, find the view that I need. So this is the side view of the nightstand. I can see that my panels are going to be 6 inches wide. So my floating panels are going to be 6 inches wide. I've got the measurements there. I know all of my measurements just by quickly looking at any of these drawings. And there's a lot to go through. I think in total this is 12 pages, so 24 sides. There's a lot of information contained in here, and it's probably only going to get more detailed in the final version. Because there's still probably a lot of stuff that I missed in here. So as I'm going through and actually building this thing, I'm going to add little notes here and there of, dimensions that I maybe missed in the drawings on that. But yeah, overall, this should be a pretty good way to work. So one of the things that is actually worth mentioning about the plans is this is a way that I found that I really like to work, and that is having a parts list. So it's a very common thing, a lot of plans that you buy, you'll be able to find these things. And so the benefit of these part lists is they tell you everything about each individual piece. And like I've mentioned in past videos, I always give them a letter designator. And so I've got a column here with all the different letter designators. So the back short stretcher on the tall dresser here is part set DQ. And I know that there's 3 of them. I know their exact lengths, including the tenon length, and I know whatever joinery is going to be attached to them. Then in some of my pieces, I have details like roundovers, curves, whatever. And then finally, I have what type of wood they're going to be made out of. So for that piece, it's going to be made from specifically 8/4 maple because it has to be thinned down to 5/8 of an inch. And so another thing that I added in these part lists that I haven't done before is I added just some simple check boxes. So when I actually go through and lay out my pieces, sometimes in other videos, you guys may have noticed that I forgot to include a piece, or I miscounted, or I did something else wrong. Here, it's going to be nice and simple. I just go and put a check in there. Then I know that I've got that piece ready and laid out compared to just kind of guessing on my parts list. So that hopefully will make it a little bit easier. And I've got 2 check boxes for laid out on the lumber and then roughed out. That way I know when it's all the pieces are actually ready to go. All right, and so moving over to the lumber pile now, you can see I've got it all sorted out here with our 3 main woods that are going to be going into this thing. So the 3 woods are walnut, maple, and white oak. So this is going to be a very similar design to the desk that I built for myself. In fact, it's actually exactly based off of that design with a few minor changes here and there. So the new thing that I'm going to be doing in this is using a cheaper wood on the inside, and that cheaper wood is going to be the maple. So all of our interior hidden components, all that internal structure is all going to be made from maple because it's a fairly inexpensive wood. And so the reason I'm going with maple instead of something like poplar, even though poplar again would be a lot cheaper than even maple, is just because it takes away from the overall fine furniture piece of this thing, in my opinion, if you use something like poplar on the inside, because a lot of our internal components are still going to be visible. Every time you pull out the drawer, you're still going to see the internals of this whole thing. So I want to make sure that it's made out of a nice quality, decent looking hardwood. And so I've mentioned this on other projects where I've used maple or birch for interiors, is that when you use a lighter wood on the inside of a dark piece of furniture, it makes all that internal space seem a lot larger for some reason. I know it's just a trick with your eye or something like that, but it definitely does make a big difference. So it makes your drawers or, internals of cabinets and all that, it just makes it seem much larger, which is just really exciting and really interesting. And so honestly, I don't even know if this is all the lumber that I'm going to need. I may end up having to make another run to the lumberyard just to pick up a little bit more, because I'm pretty sure that I've got everything I need here. I did account for a little bit extra here and there, but it's going to be kind of interesting when I actually start laying out my components to see if I can actually fit them all on everything I've got here, and to see if I have enough excess to cover other small parts of that. So when you go to start laying out your parts on the lumber, there's kind of two different mentalities you want to bring to it. First off, you want to start by laying out all of your largest pieces. So if you have anything that is basically over 5 inches wide, that's going to be a little bit harder to find within your lumber stack. If you have a large number of boards like I've got here, you want to start by laying out those larger, wider pieces just to make sure you have enough lumber to account for them, especially if you want them to be solid pieces. You don't want to go through and mark up if you have one 9-inch wide board, you don't want to go and break it up into a bunch of small components right off the bat, just to realize that you needed a 9-inch wide board later on for a different component. So you want to definitely start by doing that. But you also want to take into consideration what your priority level is. So a perfect example of this is in this bedroom set, I know that I need to build the entire structure and frame of each of these pieces before I start building the drawers for them. And the drawers I know are going to be what requires my widest pieces of material. I think some of these drawers are about 8 inches tall, so the size of them are going to need to be used. I'm going to need to use about 8-inch wide boards. But I don't want to start by laying out the drawer pieces. I want to make sure that I've got all the components for the actual structure itself, because I can very easily go to the lumberyard any day of the week in the next month or so that I'll be working on this project and pick up some more maple or whatever other wood I need to build those secondary components. So you want to start by just mentally breaking down your project. So things like the drawers, doors, the tabletops themselves are generally going to be the last components that you're going to work on once the whole structural frame of these things are together. So to break that down nice and simply, you want to start by looking at your frame components. Then in those structural frame components of your piece, you want to find whatever pieces are the widest and start by laying those out, and then just kind of go down the list from there. Again, I've got a ton of lumber sitting here, but I need to make sure that when I'm laying it out, I'm not wasting material. I want to make sure that if I'm breaking down this 6-inch wide piece of white oak, that I'm not breaking it into a 2 and a 2-inch section, because that's not going to allow me to, that's going to waste a lot of material. I want to make sure that I'm breaking it down into, good even sized pieces that are making the most out of each board. And so the area that I really like to start with is the legs for all of our pieces, because that's going to be, just the best starting place. If you don't have the verticals or the legs for your piece, you're not going to be able to actually start building the piece. So one of the big lessons I've learned when looking for leg stock is that you really want rifts on wood. Now, this is nothing that is a shocker to most woodworkers, but the way that you get it is a little bit more convoluted, because typically when you go to a lumberyard, you're wanting to buy the biggest, widest boards you can, because that's generally going to give you the best bang for your buck. Especially with a wood like walnut, you're always going to want to buy the widest boards you can so you get the most heartwood in them. But in the case of buying wood for leg stock, you generally want to buy it as narrow as you can possibly get. So in this case, these boards are all about 5.5 inches wide, and our leg stock in its final dimensions is going to be about 1 5/8 square. So I know for a fact that I can probably get at least two in out of here, if not 3 pieces. Now, if you could buy it narrower than this, that would be better, but 5 inches on 8-quarter stock is generally as narrow as you can get. And so the reason you want it so narrow is because most of this stock, once I start cutting it out, is going to end up being rifts on stock. So you saw that I already went through and I faced off the boards with my circular saw. That way I can get an idea of where I'm going to be laying out the stock and get the best possible pieces. And so now I can see on each of my 3 pieces where I'm going to be able to get the best stock from. So on this end piece here, I know that I'm probably going to be getting some back legs from it because the grain is a little bit wavy through here. It's still good rifts on stock, but it's a little bit wavy and it's not going to look as nice. We're going to have a few cathedrals showing through, so that'll make nicer back legs. Whereas on this next board here, this is going to be perfectly rifts on stock, once I actually start milling it down, because you can see that the grain is going diagonal through the two edges here. Once we get into the middle section, that's going to be a full quarter sawn piece, so whatever's left over in there will be nice to have to use, somewhere else in the project maybe. But for leg stock, it's not going to be as useful. On this last piece here, we've got the same thing, where we've got the grain coming nice and diagonally through our areas. But the other important thing with this last piece here is we've got this check right in the middle. Now, this really isn't a big deal because, like I mentioned, our leg stock in its final form is going to be 1 5/8. Trying to get a long 1 3/4 inch square piece out of 8/4 stock can be somewhat difficult. A lot of these pieces that I bought here are pretty much at 1 3/4 because they're so poorly milled. Now, this is a good point to mention. I bought this lumber from 2 different lumber yards. So this 8/4 white oak and the walnut I bought from Formations Inc. here in Calgary. By far the worst place to buy lumber in Calgary, purely because you don't get to choose what you want. They just kind of bring it out, throw it in your truck, and you have to go pay for it, which is why I ended up with what I've got here. But yeah, it's also just really poor quality stuff, and I didn't realize that. I've only bought from them a few times, and my other experiences with them were pretty good, but this time, this was horrible, and I probably won't go back there. The other stock, so the 4/4 white oak and the 4/4 maple, was all bought from PJ White, where you get to choose what you want, which is pretty good, but it does have some downsides in that their walnut is not very good quality. So ups and downs of different places, but yeah, definitely if you're in Calgary, check out PJ White. They're probably going to be the best place, because that's where I'm going to be going to get the little bit more white oak, the 8/4 white oak that I do need. And so now I've gone through and I've laid out as many pieces on these 8/4 boards as I can. So in these 3 boards, I've got all the verticals for the tall dresser, I've got all the verticals for the wide dresser, I've got 2 verticals for the nightstand. So I know that I'm short those 6 other legs for the nightstand. So I'm going to have to go and pick up 1 more of these boards. So that is all the important things to know when you're laying out leg stock, is that you just want to start by getting nice narrow boards, because you're going to have a much better chance of getting good riffs on stock. The other thing you can look for if you're actually working with nicely faced lumber, you just want to look for pieces that have nice straight grain on the edges. You're generally going to be able to get good riffs on stock if your pieces have straight grains right on the edges here. Now that I've got my leg stock laid out, I can move these pieces out of the pile here and just continue on laying out my pieces. One, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23. All right, so I've got our first set of components laid out on all the lumber you can see behind me here. So I did use the method that I talked about at the beginning of the video, but I changed it up a little bit because, like I said at the beginning of the video, what you want to try and focus on is laying out any of your larger components on your widest boards and using those wide boards to your advantage for those pieces. But there's a few key spots here where I use some of my extra wide boards that I would normally use for like a soft full drawer side. I'm using them to break down into smaller components because I get more yield that way. Because some of the downsides is if you're trying to get an 8-inch wide piece out of an 8.5-inch board, that half-inch of material is just thrown away. Whereas the way that I've broken it down on some of these wider boards, it actually works out to be pretty much precise measurements all the way across with just enough waste and excess material for me to get the milling done and to come out with my perfect size piece. And so as we've seen in some of the past projects that I've done, some of these pieces are not actually going to work out as I have them laid out here. we're going to end up having to remill them, which again is very important because I took account of that when I was buying the lumber, knowing that I might have to remake a couple small pieces here and there. And so you could literally spend a week trying to lay out all your pieces perfectly, but one wrong setup with the saw, you move it over a 1/2 inch rather than a 1/4 inch, small stuff like that can make changes here that you don't really want and can negatively affect you in the long run. So it's just better to have excess stock rather than trying to be super persnickety about your layout here. Because again, I might run into a knot. I could run into a piece of metal in any one of these pieces and literally have to throw them away because I don't like running any wood with metal in it through any of the machines in my shop. So we're just going to go through each of the 3 types that I got behind me here, and I'll just walk you guys through kind of how they're laid out. And so on the maple here, you can see a whole bunch of different widths of boards. On this side, we've got a couple boards that are around 4 inches wide. Those are a perfect fit for a couple of the components. And then the other one on the side here, I've got broken up into 2 pieces, which gives me my 1 5/8 width pieces, gives me 2 1 5/8 thick pieces that I'm going to need over there. For these wider ones, again, this is where it comes in. You can see this board is 8 7/8 wide, and I've got it broken down into 3 separate pieces. Now, the reason that this works out so well is because I can precisely fit 3 of these end pieces in here. And so all the way through this board, I've got a total of 12 of these pieces all in this one board. Because this is the perfect width for those pieces, I'm just going to get a whole bunch of them out of this board. And I still got a pretty big section at the bottom that's not being used for anything, but I'm using the majority of this board for the exact same part. So not only is that going to make milling a lot easier, it's just really good use of this board. Again, with this board in specific, there's a pretty big taper to it. So at the top, it's about 8 inches wide, and at the bottom, it's 10 inches wide. So I could probably squeeze in another one of these components if I needed to on one of the bottom sections, but I'm not going to worry too much about that because it'll be nice to know if I have the extra that it's there, but I'm not going to intentionally try to squeeze that in there because this taper is really bizarre. Going to some of the other boards here, again, same thing. We've got pieces that are just, trying to get the maximum yield. So as many pieces as I can fit into a specific width, that's mainly what I'm trying to go for. And so ideally you want to go with the same length pieces. So again, by putting all of these end pieces in a row, finding a board that fits 3 of them across perfectly, I now have to just make 1 cut across here and there's no wasted material on the length. Whereas if you're combining different length pieces, that's where you can start to run into issues. Because if I have 18 inches here, but then I have a 15-inch piece mixed in there, well, that's a whole 3 inches of waste in there that I just don't have access to because I need to cut this board down somehow. I need to make some initial cuts in this board somehow. And yeah, there's not really much you can do to save that extra 3 inches and put it into something else useful around here. Unless you want to start going with a jigsaw and cutting curves in that, which is really inefficient. And so next up is the 8/4 white oak. I actually went out and kind of in the between of the video here, I went out and picked up the other piece that I need. And I wasn't able to get a 5-inch by 8-foot piece like I've got sitting here. It ended up being a 10-foot by 7-inch wide piece. So it's going to be a lot of extra material to just have around the shop here. But I love white oak, so that's not really a big deal. And it didn't really affect the whole cost of the project. What kind of did affect it is this stuff that I bought from Formations here in Calgary. I think I paid $11.38 per board foot for this. So a little bit, decent, it's expensive, but still a decent price. Whereas the board I just picked up from PJ White was $14 a board foot. So a little bit of price difference there. I based the project off of this because this is the majority of the stock that I'm using. So yeah, that one, I just kind of have to eat the cost on part of that board. But luckily, most of that board I'm not actually using in this project. Most of it will be just used in the shop for my own stuff. So I'm kind of just hurting myself in the end. But anyway, that's not that big a deal. Now, one of the big things to consider with this 8/4 white oak is also taking into consideration a bunch of the pieces that come into this project. So I don't know where I left the plans. They're somewhere around here. The way that this is built is that we've got vertical post legs, which are going to be 1 5/8 square. And then we're going to have stretchers running along the front, along the side, and along the back. Now, those front stretchers are going to be the exact same width as the legs. They're going to be that same 1 5/8 width. So they're going to match up with the legs perfectly, which means that we can take those pieces out of the center areas of these 8/4 boards. Because again, I mentioned this earlier in the video, I don't really want to use this center bit of material for leg stock if I don't have to. If I can get my leg stock from anywhere else, that's ideal because this middle area here is going to be mainly quarter sawn stock, which is still good for legs, but not as good as rift sawn stock. So on the edges here, I'm going to get that rift sawn stock, and then in the middle here, I'm going to get that quarter sawn stock. And so these pieces in the middle that are going to be quarter sawn, that is going to be really, really good material to use for those front stretchers, which are going to end up being the same width as the legs. So we're really going to be using these boards to their maximum potential because we're going to be taking off the sections that are going to make up the legs on the edges. Then we're going to be resawing down this middle section just into thinner strips each time to make up all of our stretchers in that. And so again, this all comes down to the idea of trying to get the most out of the materials that you have because These middle sections here, really that would just be kind of throwaway material, but luckily again, because of the way that we've designed this and the way that you would design most of these pieces, you're always gonna find a use for those middle sections that aren't super useful, because all you have to do is cut them down to whatever thickness you want. Because we're gonna be dealing with, about a 1 3/4 inch wide piece in the middle here, I can really cut that down to whatever thicknesses I want. So some of my stitches are gonna be 5/8 of an inch thick, some of them are gonna be 3/4, but they're all gonna be the same length, so I can mix and match them in the middle section here, to get the best material possible out of these excess pieces here. So again, I really love working with 8/4 stock for that reason, is because if you can plan your project around working specifically with 8/4 stock, you can generally get a lot better yields out of the wood that you have. Same thing if you have thicker pieces of wood, if you can get all the way up to like 16/4, and that's just kind of the wood that you buy in stock in your shop, you can generally get a lot of really good yield out of that because it's just a little bit easier to get that extra thickness. You can cut it down to specific thicknesses that you want. Just all around, it's a little bit easier to work with. So you can see here, we actually have a decent amount of white oak that we're going to be cutting down. Now, there are still some large blank sections in this that I'm going to be using for just other white oak components that are going to be going into these projects. But overall, this is what we're going to be needing to. This is all that we're going to need to make the the external components of these of each of these pieces of furniture. And so you might be wondering why it seems like in the lumber pile that I had, there was so much more maple than white oak, but when I have it laid out here, there's there's a ton of white oak and not so much maple. And the reason for that is that when you're building pieces of furniture in this way that we're doing here, the only place where you're going to be using white oak and walnut is on the external faces. So the only place you're going to see any white oak is just on the complete outside. As soon as you open a drawer, open a cupboard, look into any of these things anywhere, it's all going to be maple. Which again is the whole reason we're using maple, is because it's a little bit cheaper. And so filling the internal area and building all your internal structure out of a slightly cheaper wood saves you a little bit of money. But again, because we're using maple, it's also going to look really cool on the inside because it's just going to seem massive because you have all these light pieces surrounded by all this dark wood on the outside. So that's why there's so much white oak here right now. So it's pretty much only in the beginning of the project here where we're going to be working with a lot of white oak. As we progress through the project, you'll see less and less of the white oak and walnut and just more maple pieces in general. And so again, here with the white oak, I just went for maximum yield, trying to get as many pieces across the board as possible. We do have some areas where I just had to accept certain amounts of waste. So for example, this board here, I only needed a 2.5 inch wide piece out of this whole long length here, but I needed the length of that piece to be about 61 inches. So that's why, again, here I had to just suck it up and deal with this large excess piece. And so what's nice though is that this excess piece that's all going to be on this board is about 2.5 inches wide. So that's a perfectly usable piece in any piece of furniture I can think of. So that's not a big waste, and because it's this long, it can easily be broken down into other pieces later on. So stuff like that, you really don't have to worry about wasting that much. It's only if you're dealing with pieces that are, I would say under 24 inches long, that's where you want to be really nitpicky about where you're placing them and trying to get the maximum yield out of the board that you're working with. So say you have 4 pieces that are all going to be 1.5 inches wide. If you can put all 4 of those pieces across one width and cut off that single length, that's going to be ideal rather than breaking them up into a group of 3 and then a single one somewhere. So that's the important thing when you're doing this pre-layout, pre-planning stuff, is you just want to figure out how to get the maximum yield out of the boards that you have.